Who is the professor? Is this position reducible to the individual who's in relation to the other, in this case, the student? If so, then is not the professor-student relationship based in the imaginary? Many a professor and student can attest to the experience of love and hate in the classroom. Look at just about any course evaluation and you'll find evidence for it. Such love and hate are based in the imaginary in various ways. The student's hate may emerge out of an imaginary understanding of the material, and so they think the professor doesn't know what they're talking about. How many times has a student presumed an understanding of the material and yet, when examined about it, not be able to produce evidence of this understanding? On the other side, the student's love able to produce evidence of this understanding. On the other side, the student's love may emerge out of their imaginary idealizations of their professor, who is looked upon as offering the image of a unified body, and in this case, a unified body of knowledge, complete and perfect. However, what if there's a third position in the room? The students, the individual professor, and the symbolic position of teacher. What would it mean to occupy that position? How would it break us out of the imaginary student-professor relationship? And finally, what does each position have to do with death? This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated.
他这天天抠我，让我陪他玩，我陪他玩一会儿，我一边玩一边逗猫一边看，烦死了，就是来回抠我，搁这玩。
To the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Lecture 17 in Seminar 2. Lecture 17 comes in the aftermath of Lacan's discussion on the Purloined Letter, and so given the intensity of the content recently, Lacan seems to slow things down a bit in this lecture, seeking questions from his audience about what has been discussed so far. However, that's not to say that this lecture offers little in terms of substance. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. And so in this video, I address the following questions. How can the teacher-student relation be thought of in light of the imaginary and symbolic? 2, how is the ego related to the subject? And 3, how are the ego and the subject each related to death? This channel addresses works of philosophy and psychoanalysis. Each video, structured by several questions, analyzes a small section as we gradually move through an entire text. To support this work, please consider liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. You can also support this work on Patreon. Link is below in the description. Upon introducing the topic of this lecture, Lacan then switches gears to address the position of the teacher in relation to knowledge and ignorance. He says something very interesting here, which tangentially ties into the topic for this lecture. He says genuine teaching awakens an insistence in students. Here he defines insistence in terms of a desire to know, which emerges only from a position of ignorance. Let's recall what he said about ignorance in Seminar 1, that it's the most important passion for psychoanalysis, and that it's not a mere ignorance, but a learned ignorance like that of Socrates. He then asks his audience to ask him a question, but to ask it in such a way that it's Lacan's question. In other words, he's asking his audience to ask questions that presuppose what they think Lacan is getting at. Though this might seem like an invitation into an imaginary relation, that's not what Lacan seems to be getting at here. Rather, I believe he's asking his audience to assume the position Lacan holds as teacher, a position that's not reducible to Lacan himself, but is sort of like a third figure in the room, the other two being the audience and Lacan himself. Doing so works to move beyond the imaginary relation that has been formed between him as a teacher and his audience as student. Now, throughout this video series, I've been reading Lacan with the intention of teaching what Lacan says, staying as best as possible within what seems to be his aims. Approaching the material in this manner, new insights have emerged for me, helping me to see the limitations of my previous ways of reading him while also trying not to idealize him, which is always a danger with a charismatic teacher. In fact, the contemporary philosopher Jean-Luc Marion, who was educated in France at a time when Lacan was actively lecturing, has said that he was struck by the effect Lacan's charisma had on individuals, so much so, in fact, that becoming Lacanized was a synonym for being lobotomized. Applying these thoughts to this YouTube channel, I wouldn't want a viewer to finish these videos with a sense that they've been given the final meaning of the text, or that there's...
这里其实有个很重要的问题，这个问题也是理解刚才那个阶级的关键。就是在这个教室里面，拉康讨论的是想象跟象征的关系嘛？问题是在这里面实在在哪里啊？在这个教室里面实在在哪里啊？沉默。本直播间谁能答对这个问题，可以给第一个这个号第一个房管。如果你们理解了，我觉得你们才能理解精神分析啊，不然你们始终也没理解。但是我也知道这个很难理解了，但这个东西跟那个玉子讲那个刚才讲的阶级其实是有关系的，但是我不知道你们能不能理解这个事情。都不是，所以你们真的还是始终没整明白这个问题。有一个人沾边了，有个人沾边了，但是还不够，但是沾边了。还有个人沾边了，有2个人都沾边了。你们要是没整明白这个问题，那拉康3节课你们始终也没太懂。有2个人各说了一部分，应该说，文凭不是属于象征秩序的东西。行吧，回答言说的我都给一个房管啊，然后回答教室本身也给一个房管。但是你们这些东西都不够，但是已经回答得很好了。阶级又是什么？教师的阶级，学生的阶级又是什么？阶级是个抽象的东西吗？阶级是个观念吗？当然不是了，这就是物，来自实在的，就是那个惰性的物啊 ，inertia 那些东西啊，不是关系那些东西，关系不还是属于想象的吗？不还是属于象征的吗？情绪感情属于想象的，这是来自实在，就是那些物呀，就是言说是这个。就是 speech 这个音调语调，然后总不是作为吧，就是作为，你猜怎么着就是作为，就是包括所有的这个座位坐在第几排，什么黑板，什么这些男，所有这些东西全部都是 real 啊，就是这个 real 就是剩出来的东西嘛，其实就是客体的，教室跟语言的能指差不多，你这样理解更好。应该说其实就是la langue，就是雅语，就是某一部分是这个。不是最没有意义的东西，你还是没整明白这个问题，因为这里面是分裂的，就是物跟主体是分裂的嘛，就是实在跟象征跟想象是分裂的嘛，是断裂的，就是实在其实也不存在的，因为它也不是。哎呀，我想看看怎么说这个问题呢？其实事实上，我们可以把那个1、2、3、4，就威米斯讲那个就是物的1、2、3、4对应上3界理论。一就是他所谓的那个什么自然物是什么？就是想象的嘛。对吧？自然物其实那个自然也是社会规范的一个东西，对不对？其实也没有什么纯自然这种东西，都是社会的范畴、社会的概念，对吧？其实就是想象的东西，社会性的，就是主体间的那种东西，就被误认成主体间的那些东西啊。然后它第2个就是那个象征物，其实就是象征的嘛，对吧？然后它第3个，它管叫什么享乐物，那个其实什么？那就是盛状，就是征状。然后它最后那个非物是什么？其实我觉得它第1个不应该是自然物，它应该把第1个就是改成就是说，想想看，最后那个非物应该是盛状的 symptom， 不太对应得上，不是很好分，没有纯物这种东西了。我刚才说那些惰性的那些 inertia， 它是不在场的嘛？就是问题在于他为什么不在场，就是比如说言说也是不在场的，他为什么不在场？这个问题是比较关键的，这就是实在跟征状之间是断裂的。比如说现在那些特别是欧美发达国，就说清华北大好了，清华北大那些教室里面坐着那些人，他们都会觉得自己是这个人类高贵的精英知识分子吗？就这个想法是被压抑的，他们会觉得自己是什么什么，比如说他也只是个鲁社。在真正的权力面前，在什么藤校面前，他也只是个鲁社，或者他会觉得他在为中华之崛起而读书，他读书将来是为了什么实现什么人生的理想之类的，所以这里面是断裂的。其实我没有指现在清北学生了，你们讲的那个叙事是一个意识形态叙事，你们讲那个东西跟我讲这个不一样，你们讲那个东西是一个故事。我只是指出这个其中的不一致性跟不一致之处了。这么说好了，如果你们在清华北大里面待过，你就知道里面的人非常的谦虚，里面很少有那种就是他们的精英主义傲慢，就是表现在他们的谦虚。 我刚才想给你们举那些白左的例子嘛，就是那些世界最好的学校里面，每个人都在为难民做设计，都在研究为什么会有贫穷，因为症状就是拒绝物带来的快感。为什么物不在场？因为跟物接近，跟实在接近，实在太有快感了，他没有办法，他只能拒绝物的快感。他的问题，他为什么要拒绝物的快感？因为他处理不了这个快感啊。怎么处理呢？你再喜欢的女人，你跟她度一之后，你对她也没兴趣了，就是主要是确实处理不了这个东西了，只能以拒绝她的方式变成一个症状。你的女生跟你表白了，但你觉得不行，你还配不上她，你不能跟她在一起。就是你们现在大概能明白我的意思吗？就是这个断裂，就是想象跟象征是对实在的拒绝了，但是这个实在是什么？其实就是物了，就是 inertia。就是物，就是有什么讲的那个，我也不知道，我也不太好对应得上，反正就是大概就这个意思。就是说，实在这些东西是什么？其实就是它本质上其实就是阶级。它为什么不在场呢？因为处理不了它，所以要进行一种否认。无产阶级没人觉得自己是无产阶级，无产阶级因为症状的问题都觉得自己是个小资产阶级，都努力的爬鄙视链。小资产阶级没人觉得自己是小资产阶级，小资产阶级都觉得自己是高贵的精英知识分子。大资产阶级没人觉得自己是大资产阶级，大资产阶级都觉得自己是无产阶级，都觉得自己每天一睁眼就养活几十口的人，钱根本只是个数字而已，根本就不重要。对，大资产阶级都是慈善家。所以这里你们要明白这种断裂了。所以你们现在大概能品过来这个时代是什么了吧？实在的快感其实就是这个快感，就是如意上是什么？其实就是所谓的母子共同体的原乐嘛。其实就是你的位置跟你的这个跟你的这个主体就是不再有剩余了，是一致的这种快感。但是每个人都在拒绝这种快感。事实上，你想想看，你在不同的那个地方说话，其实你自己已经有一种拒绝快感的方式了。你自己反思一下，你在不同的教室里面，比如说你在922大学，如果去参观课堂里面会跟老师说什么，你再想想看，你在你的一般的破大学里面会跟老师说什么。但是你在进行言说的时候，这些物都是不在场的，你意识不到你为什么要说这个，但事实上你说的肯定不一样。你后面我觉得你也很难反思得到这些问题，就不只是教室了，还有就是说言说，这个老师穿的什么，旁边的同学，因为这些惰性物当然从来不只是单纯的物，我们管它叫物，并不是说它是你们说那个什么什么就纯物，因为事实上没有纯物这个东西。那个物它只是个 inertia， 但是它是主客体一致的东西，就是它上面已经有其这个，就是相对名子说的阶级物吧，就是它其实上面是有这个再生产关系的东西。所以就是你们能大概想明白这个问题。但是什么是你的你想想看，什么是主体？你能明白这个，你能明白精神分析的意思了。就是主体是在你所在的那个能指之间，就是你在那个场，就是格式塔，其实也不叫场，其实是海德格尔用海德格尔的在场嘛比较好，或者是那个打在，就是打在的时候，所有那些东西，那个东西才是主体。然后你自己认为的那个自我那个误认是一个症状，你对所有的这个在场那些符号性的，就是过于创伤的快感的拒绝，那个你误认出来的那个自我的进行言说的那东西是个症状。你只有在实演的时候 full speech 的时候才能言说出这个创伤。你在所有你其他的东西全部都是 empty speech， 全是那个拧巴的症状。行吧，我这一部分我就讲这么多，可能你们听得懂就听，听不懂就算了，有点难。
Nothing left to consider here. My goal is not to give correct answers in summarizing and examining these seminars, nor do I hope that viewers are here due to a cult of personality and are led to watch these videos due to some charisma, though I don't think I have much to worry about on that front. Rather than a comprehensive answer to the question, what is Lacan saying? My real goal is to lead you to a more productive misunderstanding of what he is saying. This term is not Lacan's, but something that has emerged out of my reading of Lacan. What do I mean by productive misunderstanding? Perhaps you can think back to a book you read for a second time, being surprised how much you misunderstood the first. Was the first reading pointless? I certainly don't think so, and I believe this for the following reason. The only way I was able to gain the insight I did into a second reading was because the previous reading paved the path, I would have never gotten to the understanding I did were it not for a productive misunderstanding, whether based on my own reading or from some teacher who suggested a way of reading the text that perhaps now I disagree with, but that nonetheless opened the possibility for even knowing how to disagree with that professor in the first place. Of course, this means there are unproductive misunderstandings as well. Generally, those readings lead us astray to such an extent that we're blocked off from further insights, that the desire to know has been extinguished. So what I hope is that in my earnest attempt to understand Lacan and present his thoughts to you, is that I offer a productive misunderstanding that will evoke a desire for you to read Lacan yourself, to embark upon a path of deeper exploration that ultimately leads you to move past my own understanding. I encourage you to read along as we move through these videos, and when you find that a particular understanding I provide does not resonate with your own interpretation of the text, then I certainly welcome that kind of productive engagement in the comments section. And so this, I believe, is what Lacan is getting at here in his excursion.
但是他刚才吹的这一段就说，哎呀，我是怎么读的特别好，然后我希望你用我的方法，或者是用这个有效的方法可以超越我所理解的。但是他现在想要达到这个目的，恰恰是拉康不想要的东西。拉康他为什么说的这个莫名其妙、急需要牙、胡说八道？他就是不希望别人理解他，他希望别人不要把他当成一个主人能指以及一个移情的对象。他觉得大家应该试图超越他，而不是理解他。所以简单来说，他希望大家不要把他当回事儿。
Excursion about his own teaching as awakening and insistence in his students. Insistence, or the compulsion to repeat, emerges out of the mistake, out of a sense of incompleteness and failure. And this is what I mean by a productive misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that provokes a kind of insistence, which in this case Lacan identifies in terms of the desire to know. And it's the desire and not the knowledge that's important here, because once you believe you know, that you possess knowledge, desire is no more. Lacan's invitation to the audience to ask questions leads us into a discussion on a variety of concepts such as speech, death, insistence, the ego, the subject, unconscious desire, the real, and the symbolic. Of course, all these are interconnected as it's difficult to address the real and the symbolic. Of course, the ego, the subject, unconscious desire, the real, and the symbolic. Of course, all these are interconnected as it's difficult to address the relation between any two terms without reference to the others. Nonetheless, it's quite a lot for one lecture, so I've decided to highlight a few points that seem significant and that appear to build upon what's been presented so far. The first point I wish to address is the relation between the ego and the subject. Lacan reiterates much of what he said previously, that the ego is a mirage and the sum of identifications. He elaborates on its connection to the subject, that it's an impoverished point of synthesis to which the subject is reduced. Yet the ego also represents one of the significant elements of the discourse of the unconscious, a piece of the symbolic, and an indispensable element inserted into the reality of the subject. This appears to be a reformulation of what Freud said in The Ego and the Id, where he writes, the ego is that part of the id which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. If we recall, Lacan seems to equate the id with the subject itself, or at least draws a close connection between them. If the ego is derived from the subject, what then is the subject? We've already come across several responses to that question. First, the subject, though identified with the ego, is something or somewhere else, beyond the pleasure principle. It emerges from the symbolic and is intimately tied to desire, which is here in this lecture described as something coming into existence through the symbolic as well. However, this is also where the split in the subject happens. There's the subject who achieves recognition, and then there is that of the subject which is not named, what is, as Lacan puts it, quintessentially unnameable. Lacan states that this split or gap produced in the subject is where the ego takes up residence and is also where death makes itself is wearable. Lacan's name achieves. This is also where the coming into existence through the symbolic is, which is the principle. It emerged. The ego is something or somewhere else, beyond the pleasure principle. It emerges from the symbolic and is intimately tied to desire, which is here in this lecture described as something coming into existence through the symbolic as well. However, this is also where the split in the subject happens. There's the subject who achieves recognition, and then there is that of the subject which is not named, what is, as Lacan puts it, quintessentially unnameable. Lacan states that this split or gap produced in the subject is where the ego takes up residence and is also where death makes itself most felt. The unnameability of the desiring subject is akin to death, and the ego is where death makes itself most felt. How are we to understand this? Though it's not stated in this lecture, I believe that in being inserted into the primitive gap of the subject, the ego functions as a kind of imaginary compensation for this lack, seeking to fill the hole produced by the symbolic. And it's with the symbolic that one finds the death drive and the compulsion to repeat, or what Lacan likes to call insistence. The ego, seemingly associated with the pleasure principle for Lacan, is an attempt to stave off the death drive and its repetitive insistence. We might even say that the ego marks the most recognizable form of response to the death drive. In the work The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, he argues how individuals and societies are built as a defense against the recognition of our mortality. Interestingly, he calls this dimension of ourselves the symbolic self. I'd have to revisit this work a little and look at it a little bit more closely to make sure I'm accurately getting what Becker says here, but assuming it to be accurate for the minute, what Becker describes here as the symbolic self is closer to what Lacan calls the imaginary ego, which, to borrow Becker's phrase, engages in immortality projects in order to manage the terror of death. Such projects come in all forms, from self-tranquilizing highs to frenetic activity to certain hero systems that offer illusions of heaven and transcendent beings that protect us against this terror. Becker's analysis, I think, helps make sense of how the imaginary ego, functioning in the place of Becker's symbolic self, can be where death makes itself most felt. It's felt not in its direct form, which would probably lead to the fragmentation of the ego. Rather, it is experienced in the mode of flight. Support for this is found in Freud, who discusses how anxiety is the flight of the ego. What is the ego fleeing from? Well, according to Freud, it's the libido. Now, what is the libido? Well, in later seminars, we'll see Lacan begin to reconceptualize the libido as jouissance. And jouissance, according to the later Lacan, is the path towards death. I'd like to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also become a Patreon supporter by going down to the link in the description below. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.
最后讲那句 "Resistance is the path towards death"， 听得懂吗？就是那个远乐，刚才我讲的那个物的过于创伤的远乐，就是那个远乐其实是干嘛？就是不要这个创伤，对吧？Resistance就是他的目标就是消灭他自己，他的愿望就是自我毁灭，就是主体的症状的消失，主体的终结，主体的倾覆是什么？其实就是不再有这个症状，就是不再有这个差异了，不再有这个最小的差异，这是 Resistance 想要的。但是这个东西太过于创伤，所以导致主体始终对对这个原乐进行拒绝，就有各种各样的症状，就以这个对原乐拒绝的方式的不同，听得懂吗？这里不是很难，我觉得。刚才讲的实在跟物那里比较难，我现在讲这东西我觉得不是很难。好，接着听研讨班吗？还是看别的？还是我们要接着听研讨班？接着听是吗？听这晚上这么坐牢，你们也听不懂，主要是。然后再来一期啊，再来一期。
Who am I speaking to right now? Is it a college student dabbling in theory? A psychology graduate student dismayed by the standard approaches to psychological care? The lifelong learner with a voracious appetite for challenging the mind? Perhaps the seasoned Lacan scholar who's here to either further deepen their knowledge or to achieve some self-satisfaction for knowing more than me? All that and much more may be part of my imaginary construction of you, my audience. And who do I think is speaking to you? A college professor? A white male? An older YouTuber? Perhaps something else is going on here under the veneer of appearances, another discourse behind the discourse, maybe behind my imaginations of who I think I'm addressing. I'm in fact addressing a different other. And what is this other saying to me? Perhaps it's telling me that this is how I'll finally achieve the acceptance I've long sought for. And perhaps the other is also telling me that my videos are shit, that I'm wasting my time, that I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And who is this subject that I am who's addressing this other? It's something split between the self I think I am and what the other is saying to me. I am nothing but this double alienation of the ego and the other's discourse. So anyway, hi Dad. Please subscribe. This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers nothing but this double alienation of the ego and the other's discourse. So anyway, hi Dad. Please subscribe.
他这里说这个 alienation 什么，其实就是 symptom， 就是症状，就是它不过是就是一个正在言说的主体跟无意识，然后就是 double alienation 嘛，就对原来的拒绝产生的一个症状，它大概是这个意思。或者并不是这个意思了，因为在我们讨论这个问题的时候，它又产生分裂了，它再次产生分裂了。所以这就是拉康的意思，就是他也没办法，就是用一些概念性的，就是拉康避免就是用一些概念性的去来描述这个事情嘛，因为当你用概念描述它的时候，它就进行分裂，就它不过就是拒绝，就是症状，其实就是不停的在拒绝嘛，对吧？就是不停的阻碍，通过一种不可能性来产生意义，这种不可能性其实就是对原来的隔绝嘛，对时代的隔绝。
Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 18 and 19 in Seminar 2. Today, we ask the following questions. 1. What is schema L? 2. How does my desire define me? 3. Who is the big other? And 4. Why does language prevent me from accessing this big other? What I attempted to demonstrate with the beginning of this video is something like schema L, which Lacan introduces in these lectures. Schema L is a diagram consisting of two axes. On the first, we have the imaginary relation between ego, symbolized by the letter A, standing for the French word for other, autre, and the specular other, symbolized by A prime. We typically consider ourselves and our relation to others along this imaginary axis. It's who I think I am and who I think I'm talking to right now. On the other axis, we discover a different relation occurring at the level of the symbolic between the subject and what Lacan names here the big other. The subject is symbolized by the S, and it's alongside the German S, meaning the word it, which Freud uses for what in English has been translated as the id. This equating the subject with the id is something I've mentioned previously and comes up again here. The id, le ça in French, is for Lacan the symbolic it beyond the imaginary ego. It's what is in need of recognition. Then there is the other, symbolized by a capital A, again for autre, but this time referring to le grand autre, the big other. I'll say much more about this big other shortly, but important to keep in mind for the moment is that operative beneath our everyday conversations is the discourse of the big other, a discourse that forms the unconscious. Freud is often presented as a theoretician of the mind, offering an abstract set of ideas difficult to relate to. However, for Lacan, this is a misunderstanding that does not recognize how the Freudian experience begins in positing a world of desire. And it is desire that is the key to understanding ourselves and understanding the phenomenon of mental illness. Desire provides the primitive structuration of our world. It constitutes our thinking about ourselves, our experiences, and even the entire domain of philosophy, Lacan says, which is a rather provocative statement. This powerful and subversive force should not be confused with biological needs. Whereas the instincts are defined in terms of their objects, desire is not. Instead, desire is a relation to a lack. But a lack of what? This is where Lacan makes an interesting move, saying that this lack is the lack of being itself. This lack of being, however, is the very thing, or the very nothing, that allows being to come into existence and to achieve a sense of self. Now, what does this mean? Lacan seems to be evoking a kind of Hegelian dialectic here, of course mediated through Kojève, in which one achieves a self-consciousness from the other who is not me. In the case of being, its other is the lack of being. So being becomes aware of itself as existing in its relation to this lack of being. However, we have to be cautious here and not mistake this awareness with the kind of self-transparent consciousness of the modern subject who reflexively accesses its thoughts. What I become self-conscious of is the fact that I am a being that lacks, a manque à être. To put it as Augustine does in the Confessions, mihi quaestio factus sum, I have become a question to myself. And if I do not recognize the enigma that I am, and especially the enigma of my desire, then I do not know myself. It's this situation that evokes the fundamental question, do I exist or not? To be or not to be? The symptoms of the obsessional neurosis are a particular response to this fundamental question, whereby one incessantly works to justify one's existence. Now, this discussion on desire and lack may seem at first disconnected with schema L. So to understand the connection, we have to move on to our next question. We've already discussed in previous videos the importance of naming desire and its speech where desire expresses itself and can be recognized. The naming of desire is not about identifying a desire that was always already there. Rather, naming creates the desire, bringing it into existence within the world. However, this is not the end of the story, as there are a few complications that arise now. First, speech can never articulate the whole truth of desire. There always remains a surplus that exceeds speech. Second, the recognition of desire in speech requires addressing the one to whom the subject is subjected to. I am only a speaking subject because the big other has spoken to me first. And when I utter true or full speech, it's always unknowingly directed at this other to whom I am subjected. This is a relation with a fundamental alterity rather than a mirror image. Alterity here means an otherness or foreignness from consciousness. It's something completely outside of the imaginary relation and cannot be assimilated through identification. The big other is inscribed in the symbolic and is closely related to language and the law, and it's the locus of all speech. Finally, it is the unconscious, leading to one of Lacan's famous maxims that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. So what does this mean, the unconscious is the discourse of the other? The subject is constituted in part by the messages it receives from the other, in the same way as the purloined letter constitutes each of the characters. But the letter has a life of its own, a certain logic, but whose contents remain inaccessible to us. So the unconscious is not something internal to us. Instead, the unconscious is an exteriority. We don't become speaking subjects through some spontaneous gesture of the mind. We receive language by being spoken to, and thereby inheriting the capacity of speech. However, the unconscious does not then just go on by itself after language is installed. The big other insists through our speech as it is spoken within our ongoing relations to other others. And this forms the basis for what in psychoanalysis is called transference. That is, the repetition of the other's discourse with others. Unconscious desire then emerges through this discourse. Another famous maxim of Lacan that we've mentioned before is that desire is a desire of and from the other. When Lacan introduced this maxim in Seminar 1, I had the sense that he was speaking strictly of the imaginary other. However, it seems the other referred here increasingly becomes the big other, who is both the one who teaches me to desire and what I desire. which is not just a desire for the big other, but is a desire for the other's desire. Yet, despite this ongoing relation to the big other, I never end up reaching the other except in a distorted form, ending up instead with little o others. As Lacan puts it, I always aim at true subjects, and I have to be content with shadows. Why is it that the big other is fundamentally unreachable? This brings us to our fourth question for today. What prevents me from reaching the big other, Lacan names the wall of language. Language is not synonymous with the symbolic order. Though language establishes us in our relation to the big other, it's also what prevents us from understanding this other. There's an imaginary dimension to it. A prominent example of this is the subject's identification with the ego, le moi, the me, which is grammatically used as the object of a verb. There's a tendency for the subject to identify with this object, to see oneself in terms of this imaginary me. This is somewhat reminiscent of Nietzsche's statements on the effects of language, such as where he writes in Twilight of the Idols, language sees doers and deeds all over. It believes that will has causal efficacy. It believes in the language sees doers and deeds all over. It believes that will has causal efficacy. It believes in the I as being, in the I as substance, and it projects this belief in the I substance onto all things. This is how it creates the concept of thing in the first place. In other words, language has this calcifying dimension to it. And this is the wall of language, which we see here illustrated when the arrow going from the big other, which is the unconscious, the discourse of the other, when this arrow meets up with the imaginary relation of ego and little other. And as a result, the discourse is distorted, symbolized by the change from the solid line to a dotted line. The subject takes up this distorted discourse and brings it into their relations with the little other, who then becomes the source of my identifications as an ego. And we can see here that all arrows stop at the ego. And I think this may mean that the ego is the freezing of the discourse altogether. I'm not quite sure at the moment what the arrow going from the big other to the ego means, but perhaps we'll get an answer to that at some point. So Schema L offers a model for thinking about psychoanalysis. In Lecture 18, Lacan states that efficacious analysis teaches the analysand to name their desire into existence. But to do this, the analyst must be positioned on the other side of the wall of language, inhabiting the symbolic plane with as little of their ego interfering as possible. Such interference by the analyst's ego is the principal reason for interference of the desire. In Lacan's Schema L
这里这个部分他不懂是吧？这个部分他不明白，他不明白也很正常。就是这个从 big other 到 ego， 就这里就转了一圈是什么？转的这圈就是症状，对吧？拧巴了一下。这个图就是我刚才举的那个例子，就是这个 ego， 就是这个自我，其实就是主体啦。这整个这个 schema 什么就是 I， 就是我，只不过我它是就是主体是这个拧巴的东西，就是在它的意识层面 conscious 层面，它是这个拧巴了一圈。但是从这个 the other 直接到这个 ego 就是无意识层面，就是从物 the other 什么，其实就是大他者是什么？大他者是来自象征，对吧？但是这里呢，必须不要把这些，比如说什么象征、想象这个东西理解成抽象的，象征也是物，只不过它是能指的，简单来说都是能指。只有那些能指，就是我刚才讲那些什么教室啊、什么言说那些东西，就是事实上你的 ego 主体是什么，它是直接过来的，然后你意识到那个 conscious 是一个拧巴的东西，就是你作为清华北大之后，你事实上是一个精英知识分子啦，只不过你自己拧巴了一圈。
offers a model for thinking about psychoanalysis. In Lecture 18, Lacan states that efficacious analysis teaches the analysand to name their desire into existence. But to do this, the analyst must be positioned on the other side of the wall of language, inhabiting the symbolic plane with as little of their ego.
为什么要拧巴一圈？你要想这个问题，你就想为什么孩子一定要逆反一样。所以这里也是拉康觉得阿尔都塞的蛇皮之处。齐泽克也讲过这个，我这里是负责齐泽克，就是说阿尔都塞意思的 the other 什么文化 AIE 对不对？将这个 ego 就是个人征召成为一个主体，对吧？ 大都在于这个意思。文化压抑嘛，就是那些什么学校啊、什么家庭啊、什么公共场所啊、那些大楼啊，就是那些物质，然后直接将这个主体个人征召成一个主体，就警察说嘿你，然后你一转头你就成了一个 subject， 对吧？但是拉康的意思是事实上是这样没错，对，但是他拧巴了一圈，就是他在听那个警察说嘿是你的时候，他拧巴了一圈，他会想说啊是我吗？就是不同的症状不一样嘛，比如说 neurosis 什么 perversion 反应全部都不一样，对不对？所以大部分人会第一个反应就是说，这样说好了，当警察说嘿是你的时候，真正有罪之人是不会回头的，无辜之人会回头，因为无辜之人 guilty， 他就想说啊我做错了什么事情是我吗？然后有罪之人知道他叫的就是我，所以有罪之人不会动也不会回头。所以就是这里面那个精神分析就比较复杂了，就是说主体其实就是我们在 conscious 层面啊，主体就是这个意识，它拧巴了一圈，但是这个事实上确实是这样征兆的，对，只不过是就是说这个东西就是晚期马克思，就是早期马克思比较蠢嘛，早期马克思比较笨啊，这是齐泽克说的，不好意思，我复读的齐泽克啊，我没有不尊敬马克思的意思。早期马克思齐泽克说他就是一个社会学家，就是 A 决定这个 ego， 就是大他者社会存在决定了社会意识，对吧？就直接这样子的。但是拉康的精神分析跟你说不是，他是这样拧巴了一圈去的。然后马克思晚期也发现这个问题了，这就是马克思拜乌教嘛，就是拧巴了一圈。就是事实上资本家就是他也会说，哎呀钱财不过是身外之物啊，那你捐出来嘛，对吧？还有比如说那个我今儿看到一个新闻，就是 B 站的标题，那个吴京说什么让大家不要再宣传他有什么300亿票房的事情了，他绝对对不起那些幕后的人。你觉得是幕后人，你给他们钱就好了呀。因为好莱坞有些电影制度吧，我看过那个周兆龙说他现在还能从那个《黑客帝国》那个分红里面拿到钱。你首先学习人家一些制度，然后你给大家就是多发点钱，你就没有负罪感了，就没有罪恶感了呀，对吧？你是觉得哎呀钱这个事情不重要了，重要的是就是对不起他们什么的，就不钱很重要，你给他们发钱就行。他这个罪恶感就是这个拧巴，所以明白了，就全要拧巴这一圈。
Offers a model for thinking about psychoanalysis. In Lecture 18, Lacan states that efficacious analysis teaches the analysand to name their desire into existence. But to do this, the analyst must be positioned on the other side of the wall of language, inhabiting the symbolic plane with as little of their ego interfering as possible. Such interference by the analyst's ego is the principal reason for resistance. I think this is exemplified by the fact that the arrow goes from the little other to the ego. So if the analyst positions themselves as an ego, they then just represent another source of identification that further solidifies who the ego is. Progress in analysis comes then in the progressive displacement of this imaginary relation and the subject's gradual assumption of the discourse of the other. To become conscious of one's relation with the big other, who, behind the specular others, is the true but unrecognized interlocutor and the origin of our desire. I'd like to especially thank Clinton Vanderwalt for becoming a new supporter of this channel on Patreon, adding to the support provided by other Patreons listed here. You can also support this work on Patreon. The link is below in the description. And if you would like to support this work in other ways,
好，听完了这一期，反正这个人勉强听一听吧。但是他很多东西说的，他没有穿越他自己的幻想，作为一个精英知识分子的幻想，所以我讲这些他理解不了，他理解不了是什么阻止了他，并不是他的知识不够，他没有聪明，只不过是他，没有成为一名无产阶级，所以这导致了他的那个，对思想和想法就停留在这个症状的享乐中，穿越不了幻想。OK， 好了，鼓鼓掌，学完了，今天我们可以去复景了，学就学到这儿吧。